It was the greatest lie America ever told itself. Gold, just sitting in the ground, waiting. All you had to do was get there first. In 1849, that lie crossed the entire country at the speed of rumor. It moved through farms and factories and failed businesses and broken marriages. It found men who had nothing and men who had something and told both of them the same thing. Go west, get rich, start over. 250,000 people made the decision within 2 years. Most of them lost everything, not some of them, not the unlucky ones. Most of them, the overwhelming, documented, historically verified majority of the people who dropped what they had and crossed a continent chasing gold, came back with less than they left with, or didn't come back at all. This is that story, not the discovery, not the adventure, not the version that got turned into mythology before the mud on the miners' boots had even dried. The real one. The one that happened to the 250,000 people who believed the lie and paid for believing it with everything they had. Stay with me. Before a single pan hit a single river, getting to California was already trying to kill you. The overland routes west crossed 2,000 miles of terrain that had no interest in your gold rush ambitions. Desert, mountain, river crossings with no bridges, passes that were navigable in summer, and death traps from October onward. And the men and families who took the overland routes in '49 and the years immediately following walked into conditions that the excitement of departure had not prepared them for, and that the distance from help made impossible to escape once they were in them. Cholera was waiting at the Missouri River. That was where the wagon trains assembled, where thousands of people from across the country converged in the spring, bringing with them the diseases of the cities and the farms and the crowded boats that had carried them west to the jumping-off point. Cholera spread through contaminated water, and the Missouri River staging grounds in 1849 were a cholera delivery system of extraordinary efficiency. Thousands of people, inadequate sanitation, shared water sources, or the particular chaos of a mass departure that nobody had organized and nobody was managing. Men who had sold their farms and said goodbye to their families and traveled weeks to reach the Missouri River died there. Before the journey started, before they saw a single mile of the trail west, before the gold rush gave them any opportunity at all to succeed or fail on its own terms. The ones who survived the staging grounds moved west into the heat. The trail in summer was not the landscape painting. It was dust so thick it coated everything: clothing, food, the inside of your mouth, the membranes of your eyes. It was water that looked acceptable and wasn't. It was the particular mathematics of carrying enough food for a 2,000-mile journey in a wagon that had weight limits and terrain to cross that punished every extra pound. What men threw away: furniture, tools, supplies, things they had packed carefully and considered essential, because the oxen were failing and the mountains were ahead and something had to go. The mountains were the final exam. The Sierra Nevada in late season were not a landscape you negotiated. They were a landscape that set the terms and waited to see if you could meet them. The passes closed in October, and they closed without warning, and they stayed closed until spring. The Donner Party. 47 people trapped in the Sierra Nevada in the winter of 1846 to 47, 2 years before the gold rush began, left a record of what happened when the mountains closed around you that everyone heading west in '49 had heard about and tried not to think about directly. Some of them didn't make it over before the snow came. The ones who took the sea route thought they had the safer option. They were partially right and completely wrong in ways that took months to reveal themselves. The voyage around Cape Horn at the southern tip of South America covered 17,000 miles. and took between 5 and 8 months depending on weather, which at Cape Horn was not a factor you planned around so much as a factor that planned around you. The seas at the Horn were documented by every sailor who had experienced them as something categorically different from normal ocean conditions. Waves of a height and force that seemed to belong to a different physical reality. Winds that could pin a ship in place for weeks. Cold and wet and darkness that ground down everyone aboard, with a thoroughness that the excitement of departure had not prepared them for. Ships sank, not occasionally, with enough regularity that the insurance mathematics of the voyage around the Horn reflected the real probability of not completing it. Men who had never been to sea discovered in the worst possible context what being at sea actually meant: the confinement, the motion, the diet of preserved food that deteriorated over months, the particular psychological pressure of being on a vessel in the open ocean with no option to leave and no control over what happened next. The Panama route was faster and more immediately dangerous. Cross the Atlantic to the Caribbean, transit the Isthmus of Panama by whatever means the jungle and the terrain permitted, or board another ship on the Pacific side. The transit of Panama in 1849 was not the engineered passage of later decades. It was jungle. It was mud. It was rivers crossed on improvised rafts and paths that disappeared into vegetation so dense that orientation became uncertain within minutes of leaving any cleared ground. And it was malaria. The Isthmus of Panama in 1849 was one of the most efficient malaria transmission environments on Earth. And the disease was not understood. The role of mosquitoes in transmission would not be established for another 50 years. And the treatments available were limited to quinine in quantities that were often insufficient and distributed with consistency that depended entirely on what supplies had made it to Panama and whether those supplies had been appropriately preserved in tropical conditions. Men crossed the isthmus and arrived at the Pacific port of Panama City already sick. They waited weeks for ships north because the demand for passage to California had overwhelmed every available vessel. They waited in a port city with inadequate accommodations, inadequate food, inadequate water, and the continuing presence of the disease they had already contracted and not yet fully expressed. Some of them never boarded a ship. They died in Panama City, waiting for a passage to a gold rush that was going to make everything different, in a port town that had no particular interest in their ambitions and no resources to address their deterioration. Those who survived the journey arrived in California, and California in 1849 was not what the letters home had described. The letters home had been written by men in the first flush of arrival, before the reality had fully assembled itself around them. They described a place of possibility, of gold visible in the rivers, of men making fortunes in days. Those letters crossed the country and arrived in the hands of people who read them in the context of their own difficult circumstances and made decisions based on what the letters said rather than what the letters couldn't yet know. For by the time the 250,000 arrived, the surface gold was gone. The easy placer gold, the flakes and nuggets that could be recovered from riverbeds and sandbars with a pan and patience, had been worked over by the men who arrived first. What remained required more equipment, more labor, more capital, more time. The individual prospector with a pan and a dream was already an anachronism by the time most of the gold rush participants arrived, replaced by organized mining operations with the resources to go deeper and the legal and financial infrastructure to claim and hold the ground they worked. The men who arrived late, which was most of them, found a landscape that had been transformed by the men who arrived early in ways that left almost nothing for the newcomers. The good claims were taken, and the accessible ground was worked. The rivers closest to the early strikes had been redirected, dammed, hydraulically blasted, and generally subjected to every extraction technique that the technology of the period permitted, by men who had gotten there first and had no obligation to share what they had found with the people showing up behind them. The mining camps where the latecomers ended up were not the romantic communities of the mythology. They were among the most dangerous environments in North America. The population of California exploded from roughly 800 non-native inhabitants in 1848 to 300,000 by 1855. That growth happened without infrastructure, without sanitation, without housing stock, without supply chains that could feed and clothe 300,000 people in a geography that had previously sustained a fraction of that number. The mining camps that sprang up across the foothills of the Sierra Nevada were improvised communities in the most literal sense. Collections of tents and rough wooden structures assembled by people who had no construction materials, no building skills, and no expectation of staying long enough to justify permanent investment. The water in these camps came from whatever was available, which, after mining operations had been running for months, meant water that had been processed through every upstream human and industrial activity and arrived at the point of consumption, carrying the accumulated biology of everything that had happened to it along the way. Dysentery moved through the camps with the patient efficiency it brought to every overcrowded, undersanitized environment it encountered. Typhoid followed. Cholera appeared with the regularity of a recurring seasonal event rather than a catastrophe, because in the mining camps of the California Gold Rush, it was essentially a recurring seasonal event, arriving when conditions were right, taking a percentage of the population, retreating and returning. Scurvy was epidemic. The supply chains reaching the mining camps were inconsistent and expensive, and carried almost nothing fresh. The cost of food in the camps during the peak years was extraordinary by any comparison. Eggs at prices that represented a day's wages for a man in a stable Eastern job. Vegetables at prices that made them luxuries rather than staples. Fresh meat at prices that meant most miners ate preserved protein in quantities that sustained function without providing the nutritional range that sustained health. The gums bled, the teeth loosened. Men who had left home healthy and arrived in California healthy developed over months of the mining camp diet. The slow, systemic deterioration of scurvy, without understanding what was happening to them or why. The work itself was destroying them simultaneously from a different direction. Placer mining, panning rivers, and working sandbars sounds simple and was in fact physically punishing in ways that accumulated without mercy. Standing in cold mountain water for 8 to 12 hours a day, bent over a pan, arms working continuously, was in temperatures that in the high Sierra varied from scorching midday heat to cold, that made the river water feel like it was extracting heat directly from the bones. The cold water exposure produced a chronic inflammation in the joints and muscles of men who did this work day after day that had no name in the medicine of the period, but that we would recognize now as a combination of repetitive strain, injury, and the physiological response to sustained cold water immersion. When placer mining gave way to hard rock mining, the extraction of gold from underground seams requiring drilling, blasting, and tunneling, the dangers changed form without diminishing. Underground in the gold mines of California, Men breathed air carrying rock dust and dynamite residue for the entirety of their working shift. The ventilation in early mines was improvised and inadequate. The lighting was candles, which consumed available oxygen and added carbon monoxide to an environment already compromised by the dust and the exhalation of multiple men working in a confined space. The heat in deeper shafts was extraordinary. The Earth's internal temperature increases with depth, and mines that chased gold downward into the rock found temperatures that made sustained work physically impossible, forcing rotation schedules that kept men moving in and out of the worst sections but never addressed the underlying problem. The dust was the slow disaster. Silica particles from the rock, small enough to pass through the body's respiratory defenses and lodge in the deep tissue of the lungs, accumulated invisibly over years of exposure. In the first symptoms, a persistent cough, a mild shortness of breath that a man might attribute to being out of shape or sleeping poorly, arrived so gradually that most men dismissed them until the dismissal was no longer possible. By the time silicosis had progressed to the point of obvious impairment, it had been destroying lung tissue for years. There was no treatment. There was no reversal. There was only the continued narrowing of what the body could do, and the continued pretense for as long as it could be sustained that this was something other than what it was. The mercury used in gold processing was a separate and immediate poison. Amalgamation, the process of using mercury to separate gold from the surrounding material, was standard practice throughout the California Gold Rush period. Mercury binds to gold, is forming an amalgam that can be separated from the ore and then heated to drive off the mercury and recover the gold. The heating produced mercury vapor. The mercury vapor was inhaled by the men doing the work in quantities that the ventilation of a frontier processing operation did nothing to reduce to safe levels, because there were no defined safe levels and no regulatory framework that would have enforced them if there had been. Mercury poisoning produces recognizable progression. Tremors first, in the hands, then spreading, then cognitive effects, the particular neurological damage of heavy metal accumulation that manifests as memory problems, personality changes, difficulty with the kind of complex reasoning that daily life requires. And the phrase mad as a hatter entered the English language from the hat-making industry's use of mercury in felt processing. The mining industry's use of mercury was no less toxic and considerably less documented. Men shook, men forgot things. Men became, over months of exposure, different from the people they had been before the exposure. Not dramatically, not in ways that anyone around them, also exposed, necessarily recognized as chemical in origin, but measurably, progressively, permanently. And underneath all of this, underneath every individual way that the gold rush was destroying the people who came for it, was the destruction it was doing to the people who were already there. California's indigenous population before 1848 numbered approximately 300,000 people. By 1870, fewer than 30,000 remained, 90%, gone in 20 years, not from a single catastrophic event, from the accumulated weight of what 300,000 newcomers did to a landscape and its inhabitants when they arrived, with the conviction that the land was theirs and the people on it were obstacles. Miners drove indigenous communities from their food sources. They contaminated the rivers that communities had depended on for generations, with mining waste that made the water unusable and the fish inedible. They killed directly. The vigilante violence against indigenous Californians during the gold rush period was documented, widespread, and largely unprosecuted, because the legal system that would have prosecuted it was built by and for the people committing the violence. The California state government paid bounties for indigenous scalps during this period. This is not a contested historical claim. It is documented. The state funded the killing with public money, and the killing happened with the efficiency that public funding and legal sanction provide. The gold rush mythology has no room for this. The mythology is about the 49ers, about the adventure and the hardship, and the men who came and tried, and some of whom succeeded, and most of whom failed, but all of whom were part of something that felt, from a sufficient distance, like American destiny expressing itself in the California hills. The people who were in those hills before the 49ers arrived are not in the mythology. They're in the numbers, 90%. The men who came for gold and found something different from what they expected mostly went home eventually. Not rich. Poorer than they left, in money and in health. The savings spent on passage and supplies, the months of wages lost, the body carrying whatever the camps and the mines and the contaminated water had deposited in it, the silica in the lungs, the mercury in the nervous system, the chronic joint inflammation from months in cold water, the nutritional deficiencies that had left marks that didn't fully resolve when the diet improved. Some of them stayed because going home meant admitting what had happened, because the letter they had written to their families describing the fortune they were about to make was still sitting in a drawer somewhere back east. And returning without the fortune meant returning to that letter and to the people who had read it and believed it and waited. Some of them stayed because they had nothing to go back to. They had sold what they had to fund the journey. The farm was gone. The business was gone. Whatever foundation their previous life had rested on had been liquidated in service of a dream that had not produced what the dream promised. The West kept them, not out of generosity, out of the same indifference it kept everyone. The gold rush produced fortunes for a small number of people and took everything from a very large number of others. The men who got rich were mostly not the miners. They were the men who sold the miners what they needed. The merchants, the supply operators, the men who understood that in a gold rush the reliable money is not in the gold. Levi Strauss made his fortune selling durable pants to miners. The men who sold picks and pans and boots and flour, and the approximate whiskey that passed for liquor in the camps, those men made money with a consistency that the gold in the ground never provided to the men digging for it, because the miners needed those things every day regardless of whether they found gold. And the merchants were there every day regardless of what the miners found. The gold rush was not a story about gold. It was a story about who was selling the dream and who was buying it. The people selling it got rich. The people buying it got California in 1849, the mud, the contaminated water, the camps without sanitation, the mercury vapor and the rock dust, and the cold river water, and the diet that took teeth and energy and years of life in exchange for the daily possibility of a discovery that most men never made. 250,000 people crossed a continent or an ocean for that possibility. Most of them came back with less than they left with. The ones who didn't come back are still there, in the California soil, in cemeteries that are mostly unmarked and mostly forgotten, in the ground that the mythology turned into a backdrop, for a story about American ambition and possibility and the courage to chase a dream. The ground remembers what the mythology forgot. It always does.